So today then I'm going to do the third of the A-Level English Language AQA specification, Introduction to Language Levels, and this third one is about semantics. So without further ado then, let's quickly refresh ourselves of what the language levels are. So there are a number of language levels that we use as a framework for exploring text or child language or sociolinguistics, etc. So we look at phonology and prosodics, we look at lexis, we look at semantics, grammar and morphology, pragmatics, and graphology. And if you haven't seen the first video, I suggest you go back to those so that you can work through the first two on phonology and prosodics and lexis and have an understanding of what some of this language means. So as I mentioned at the start today then, I'm going to look at semantics, which is basically the study of how we manage to place meanings into words or lexemes that we use, how these meanings are encoded into those words, and how we then extract that meaning from those words. Some of the key terms that you're going to need to familiarise yourself with if you're going to be talking about the semantic language level are semantic field, collocates, fixed expressions, synonyms, euphemism, dysphemism, antonym, hyponymy, denotation, connotation, and metaphor. And some of these words are possibly going to be familiar from Key Stage 4, but we'll still go through them in case you've forgotten. So we need to accept then that most of the words that we use are symbolic, the words that we use to describe concepts in the real world or objects in the real world. There's no real relationship between the word we use and the object itself. About the only time that might occur is when we're dealing with words that are onomatopoeic. And if we look back at lexis, there's a whole section on onomatopoeia. So the relationship between a word then that we use for an object or concept and the object it refers to is entirely arbitrary. There's no logical connection. And most of the words that we use in our language, in fact in any language, have a standard or shared cultural meaning that everybody accepts that this word means this particular concept or object. And if you go to the dictionary, that's where you're going to find that standard shared cultural meaning. So this is what we refer to as the denotation of a word. So used in specific contexts, words can take on much more than their denotation. They can have a much more developed or elaborate meaning. And one of those words, for example, is the way we use the word legend to describe somebody. So if you're going to have a look in the dictionary at the denotation of the word legend, it has a very specific meaning. However, we don't quite use it in that sort of way. So when we use it to describe a celebrity, a relative, a teacher, a friend, when we're using so-and-so is a legend, what do we actually mean? Is the meaning slightly different? So there, the context of how we're using the word legend changes the meaning to some extent. So let's have a look at semantic fields and collocations then. So words can often develop or even alter their meaning when we combine them with other words. And one way we can look at words is to see whether they are grouped around a particular topic or theme. Are they providing cohesion? Are they providing a thread that knits the text together? And if we can find a set of words that are grouped around a particular theme or topic, then we say it belongs to the same semantic field. So doctor, nurse, hospital all come from the semantic field of medicine. And medicine is a fairly broad semantic field, but we can make them even narrower or more specific. So if we say scalpel, swab, forceps, suture, anaesthetic, all of these are much more defined within the field of surgical equipment and procedures. So that's a much narrower semantic field. So we can have broad or narrow semantic fields. And sometimes we find that words are commonly associated with another word, and we're often found side by side and in common use with them. And these are called collocates, and often seen so frequently they become kind of fixed expressions. So emergency ward, cosmetic surgery, waiting room. These are examples of collocations. So let's move on to synonymy, antonymy, and hyponymy then. So we can also explore the relationships between words by looking at their meanings and seeing when they have their equivalents or a total contrast to them. And they may be used in different ways depending on the context. And these might have to do with formality, regional variation, situation, and we'll possibly get into regional variations a little bit later on in the course. So let's have a look at these words: mush, pal, bro, bud, old china, bestie, colleague, mucker. All of these are synonyms for the word friend. And there are particular contexts in which we'd use these. Unless you're a Cockney, you're unlikely to be using old china plate, mate. Unless you were familiar with that. Mucker is my old mucker. Tends not to be used by younger people. There's a particular generational use of that. So that would give us some indication about generation. Bro. You're not going to be seeing your granny or granddad using the word bro to describe their friends. Or maybe you will. Maybe I'm being too broad in my stereotyping of all people. Perhaps they do it ironically. So this is an example of where, a word with an equivalent semantic value is being used in a specific context, in a specific way. Sometimes writers and speakers use more socially acceptable language or phrases, and we call this euphemism. And if we use harsher, more blunt, or possibly even offensive or taboo lexis, then this is called dysphemism. So how might that actually work? So object then that we'll be familiar with, the toilet, a fairly standard word. Denotation, a toilet, a piece of furniture used to dispose of waste, whatever, however you care to describe it. Go and look it up in the dictionary. Now, one of the words that we can use is restroom, and that gives no indication of what the place is actually used for. It's not really used for resting. So this is an example of a euphemism. However, if we say I'm going to the shitter, there's absolutely no ambiguity about what that object is used for whatsoever. And some people would find that quite offensive. So that would be an example of a dysphemism. So perhaps take a few minutes to think of what other euphemisms do you know for the toilet? And similarly, what other dysphemisms do you know for the toilet? And moving on then to antonyms and hyponyms. So dealing with antonyms first then, you're probably familiar from GCSE that an antonym, probably even from Key Stage 3 actually, an antonym is a word that has an opposite meaning. And we can break antonyms down into two types. We can have complementary antonyms, or we can have gradable antonyms. So when there's a binary opposite, it's either or, so alive or dead, or boy or girl, or on, off, entrance, exit, interior, exterior. These are what we call complementary antonyms. But other antonyms are more gradable, and usually we can see whether it's a gradable antonym by a quick test. Can we put the word quite in front of it? So quite heavy, quite light, quite dark, quite young, quite old. And on to hyponyms then. And hyponym is a word that refers to something in a quite general way, and then we move down through a set of words to become much more specific. So I've given the example here of electronics. So electronics refers to quite a broad range of practices and objects. And within electronics, we have electronic hardware, and we can have white goods such as dishwashers, fridges, etc. Similarly, we can have electronic communications hardware such as computers. So we've broken it down even further. Computers come in various different types. There are desktops, laptops, tablets. So we can move down into laptop, and we can get even more specific about laptops, and we can talk about the touchpad. So gradually we're moving through a set of words. Gradually it becomes more specific. And this is an example of what we call the hypernym. So, image then of Tom Hanks as Forrest Gump, and famously said, "Life is like a box of chocolates." Always given that line to say, rather. So obviously then, life is not like a box of chocolates. There is using a synonym. There is using a simile, and I actually want to talk about metaphor here. So one of the more interesting features of semantics is the way that we can often understand objects or concepts or phenomena by describing them using something else. And this occurs in our everyday language, not just in literature. You should be really quite familiar with metaphor already from your study in English literature at Key Stage 4, and some of the work you'll have done at Key Stage 3. So I'm not going to go into great depth about explanations of metaphors, but it's interesting that the writer Stephen King says the function of a metaphor is it allows us to see an old thing in a new and vivid way. And quite often using the right metaphor can condition the way we think or perceive or have reactions to what the writer is telling us. So when Shakespeare said, "All the world is a stage," it makes us think of our life as a dramatic performance. Is what we do in our everyday life always genuine? Is it sometimes put on for particular audiences? Do we change the way we're performing? Does our life have a narrative arc? How do we use our clothing as a costume? So all the world's a stage brings up all these sorts of ideas about life and makes us think about it slightly differently. Slightly more negative one, love is a battlefield. We normally think of love as something pleasant, harmonious, but when we say battlefield, it makes us think of planning, strategies, tactics, negotiations and treaties and compromises we make, and maybe even the weapons we use for seduction of somebody else. So it makes us look at love in a slightly different way from the way that we'd usually conceive it. Here then are a few metaphors, some literary ones to start with. So the parents looked upon Matilda, obviously from Roald Dahl's Matilda. So Matilda here being described as a scab, and a bit of an elaboration of how they perceived Matilda. Son was a toddler. I can't remember where that one's from off the top of my head. She's all states and all prince's eye. Nothing else is, it should be. That's from John Donne, metaphysical poet. And if you can look into the seas of time and say which grain will grow and which will not, speak then to me. Those of you who've studied Macbeth at GCSE or literature should be familiar with that one. But as I said, not only literature, but everyday life or popular culture. So here are some metaphors from various songs, and I'll leave you to get a look those up or have a look at them and think about what they mean. And the next time then we'll move on to grammar and morphology. There is a worksheet that will accompany this video, and if you'd like that, do click the link to get yourself a copy. Thanks for listening.